Atul. So we just came out of your expert panel session, and the discussion went sort of all over the place, lots and lots of topics. But I guess one of the things people were talking about is the value proposition of Brazil. So how do you see it coming in from the US and comparing Brazil to other places?
Yeah, so I think first of all, when you get analysts on a panel, that's what happens, right? They want to get their viewpoints across. You probably heard cloud about 30 times. But I think the key thing for me, this is probably my 6th or 7th visit to Brazil in the last, I would say, 4 years. The key for me is, the domestic market is so big. And if you look at the growth just the last year, it's 40%. I was talking to one of the suppliers and I said, how much did you grow? He said 40%. So why would you really focus on the international market and be victim to the changes in currency and truly higher standards? Right? Because if you start looking at the markets like the US, you're used to dealing with global players that have much higher standards. So I think from that perspective, I tend to see Brazilian players focus largely on Brazil. And I think there's nothing wrong with it. Why not, right? The other thing is, as Brazil's economy is rising, major global players, I'm not just talking about IT, whether you're in consumer products or anything, you have to have an operation in Brazil. Otherwise you're leaving out one of the biggest markets in the world. But when you come here, just like people did in China, you look for somebody that's local. And so very likely you're going to end up going to a BRQ or a Stefanini or a CNIT or a TOTUS or somebody else. Why? Because they are the local players. But I think the smarter companies, you heard that also from some of the companies, they do have 20-30% of the business outside of Brazil. And I think the good thing is that they might not be really making margins on that business that they do for the local business, but what it's doing is it's forcing them to actually adopt some of the global practices. And I think that's what's going to help them compete against the Accentures, the Capgeminis of the world, because the reality is, being 6th largest economy, those players are going to be here. Yeah. They're already here, but they're going to be here in a much bigger way over the next 4 or 5 years.
And one of the things that, you mentioned there about the export market is quite small, and I think out of a software services market of about $85 billion, only 2.5 is exported. Yeah. So it's completely different to, say, the Indian IT industry, and yet everybody keeps comparing Brazil and India. We're not quite at the level of India. So why does that image still persist so much?
I think I think it's a tendency for people to look to wherever the success is, and I think also being a brick, I would compare Brazil more to China when it comes to IT. Right? It's if you look at the Chinese players, they're very much focused on the domestic market, and who's the likely customer base? It's the multinationals that are trying to operate in China. And there's a very little business that they're doing that's truly export. So I think people tend to do that. But I would suggest that the largest Brazilian player has 9,000 employees, but the market is 85 billion, just the domestic market. I would have expected the largest player to be somewhere between 50 to 100,000 people, not 9,000. What that tells you is, number one, is I don't believe companies are adopting outsourcing at the pace that they are in some of the more developed markets. Right? Number two, there's not a lot of consolidation that has happened in the players. So you tend to have a just fragmented industry as such. And I think the third would be is everybody is focused on the high end, and so there's no real factory that exists. And if you're looking for scale, you have to build a factory. I think that's where maybe you can learn lessons from India. How do you build a factory? But at the same time, maybe have a high-end development model that's more innovative, more agile, a lot better than India is. And I think we just heard a story from Johnson & Johnson that probably tells you that you could do that, right? You could have a more innovative model.
Yeah. So if you were looking at a couple of the trends ahead, do you think that, forget about offshoring, but industries, companies in Brazil are going to do a lot more outsourcing locally to suppliers, and possibly foreign companies like IBM, Capgemini, even buying some of these local companies?
I absolutely see it. I believe in the next 2 to 3 years, you'll see a significant part, maybe a third of the top 10 players being acquired by either, an American player like an IBM or others, or by probably, players out of India, basically the larger players. I believe that has to happen. I think the other thing you're going to see is, I think you're going to see consolidation of the tier 2s being bought up by the tier 1s as they start looking for volume. I think the other thing is, the easiest expansion for these companies will be into Latin America. I'm not sure why everybody wants to focus on the US market, where some of the fastest growing economies are right here. I've been spending a lot of time in Colombia. the government outsources more than anybody else. And when you start looking at the maturity of suppliers, you actually are seeing that the Brazilian suppliers are actually more mature than many of the other LATAM suppliers. Now, of course, there's some good players out of Mexico and Argentina, but I would say that these guys are actually very competitive, you know. And so you could go after the Latin market also. But consolidation is definitely, I see both international players, but also locally happening.